It started with a question no one ever dared to ask out loud. Why did Prince Andrew break his silence now? After decades of carefully controlled interviews, polished denials, and palace-approved statements, why would a man known for avoiding public vulnerability suddenly decide to speak about his connection to Meghan Markle? People thought the chapter was closed. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what if it never was? At 65, most royals fade quietly into ceremonial roles and controlled appearances. Yet Andrew didn't just reappear. He re-entered the conversation with a sentence that froze every reporter in the room. It wasn't dramatic in volume, but in implication. A sentence that hinted at private moments, hidden history, and secrets the palace had intentionally buried. You have to wonder, was this planned? Or was it a slip? Because here's the part no one expected. His tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't bitter. It was something stranger, almost resigned, as if he had accepted that silence was no longer protection. And the world reacted the only way it knows how now. It didn't whisper. It exploded. Suddenly, timelines changed. Old photographs resurfaced. Questions about overlapping years and unseen encounters took over headlines. People started connecting dots that had never been placed on the same page before. But the biggest shock wasn't what Andrew said. It was what he didn't. Why did he pause before answering the question about how well he knew Meghan? Why did he glance at the floor, as if calculating the cost of every word? Why did the palace issue a statement only hours later? A statement that clarified nothing. Something shifted. You could feel it. Because stories like this don't resurface by accident. Not in the royal world. Not when reputations are currency and silence is strategy. And that leads to the question no one wants to touch. If Andrew truly had nothing to hide, why wait until now to speak? The timing is too precise. Meghan's ongoing public battles. The monarchy under pressure. A shifting global narrative about accountability, loyalty, and truth. It's almost as if the moment demanded a confession or a warning. But here's the twist almost everyone missed. This isn't really a story about two people. It's a story about the one thing the royal family fears more than scandal: unpredictability. Because once one person breaks ranks, even slightly, the entire system starts to shake. And the cracks don't appear where you expect them to. What Andrew hinted at may not destroy reputations. It may expose alliances. And that is only the beginning. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The shockwaves didn't stop at the press room doors. They ricocheted across every corner of the internet, from late-night commentary shows to quiet group chats where people pretended not to care but couldn't look away. It became the question everyone repeated in slightly different words. What was Prince Andrew really trying to say? Because here's the truth no one wants to admit. When a royal speaks, every syllable is intentional. There are no casual sentences, no accidental phrasing, not when the stakes are this high. So the moment Andrew acknowledged that he had spent more time with Meghan Markle than anyone previously knew, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the admission, it was the uneasiness that followed. The kind that suggests there is far more underneath the surface than anyone is prepared to confront. But to understand why this moment matters, you have to rewind. Not to Meghan's arrival on the royal scene. Not even to her wedding. You have to go back to the months before anyone in the public knew her name. The period where the royal family was aware of her existence long before the press was. The corridors where whispers travel faster than announcements. The private gatherings no cameras ever reach. Ask yourself this. How many times do paths cross behind the scenes before the world is officially introduced? How many conversations happen off record? How many impressions are formed long before the public narrative begins? Because Meghan Markle did not enter the royal world as a blank page. And Andrew's sudden willingness to talk suggests that the unwritten chapters may be more important than the ones we already know. The palace knows timing better than any institution in the world. They understand distraction, anticipation, deflection, and silence. So when someone breaks the rhythm, even slightly, it sends a message louder than a headline. And here's the part that made insiders nervous. Andrew didn't deny anything. He didn't shut the door. He left it open, just enough for questions to pour through. Journalists replayed the clip frame by frame, searching for meaning in his pauses. Was it regret? Was it caution? Or was it the realization that the truth, once hinted at, cannot be resealed? Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Secrets don't stay buried in the digital age. All it takes is one new voice, one memory resurfaced, one sentence that contradicts the record, and suddenly the past becomes urgent again. People began digging. Old travel logs, philanthropic events, overlapping appearances the public never paid attention to. And slowly, a pattern formed. Not scandal, but proximity. Not rumor, but access. And that raises the question no one expected to be asking in 2025. Why did Prince Andrew have so many opportunities to interact with Meghan before and after she married into the family? Most royals stay in their lanes. They attend assigned events, keep defined roles, interact within predictable circles. But this situation wasn't predictable. It wasn't procedural. It blurred boundaries that were supposed to remain separate. And if that sounds confusing, imagine how it felt inside the palace. Because nothing creates panic faster than unpredictability, especially when it comes from someone already surrounded by controversy. And yet, for the first time in years, Andrew wasn't deflecting. He wasn't refusing to comment. He wasn't hiding behind carefully prepared statements. He was speaking, and speaking voluntarily. That alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through royal analysts who have studied these dynamics for decades. So the question becomes, what changed? Did he feel backed into a corner? Was he attempting to control the narrative before someone else did? Or was this something entirely different? A personal decision, made not out of strategy, but out of inevitability? There's another possibility, one almost no one has considered. What if Andrew wasn't revealing something new, but correcting something that had been wrong all along? Because the public always assumes silence equals secrecy. But sometimes silence is punishment. Sometimes silence is imposed, not chosen. And if that's true, then this moment wasn't an accident. It was a shift in power, a crack in the control, a signal that someone, somewhere, no longer feared the consequences of speaking. Think about that. What happens when a royal decides they have nothing left to lose? History tells us exactly what happens: chaos. Not explosive chaos, quiet chaos. The kind that starts with a single sentence and ends with a legacy rewritten. And here's the most intriguing part. Andrew didn't share details. He shared implication. He planted a seed, not a statement. And seeds don't stay small. They grow. Especially when the soil is already unstable. People don't realize how fragile the royal ecosystem is. From the outside, it looks polished, perfected, indestructible. But from the inside, it operates like a game of balance. One misstep from one member can shift the weight for everyone else. Which is why the palace's response spoke louder than Andrew's words. No denial, no clarification, just urgency. A statement issued faster than anyone expected, and yet, it explained nothing. It didn't correct the narrative. It didn't reassure the public. It didn't distance the monarchy from his comment. It only did one thing. It confirmed that the family was caught off guard. And if the palace is surprised, then the rest of us should be paying attention. Because that never happens. Not without reason. Not without history. Not without consequence. So why now? Why this moment? Why this topic? And why connect himself publicly to Meghan when the royal family has spent years attempting to distance itself from controversy? Unless distancing no longer serves the story. Unless silence is no longer sustainable. Unless the truth, whatever it is, was going to surface with or without him. There's another layer to this. People forget that timing is everything in royal communication. Nothing overlaps without intention. And Andrew's unexpected openness happened at a time when the monarchy was already under pressure. Public distrust, internal tension, shrinking influence. So what happens when a vulnerable institution faces a new, unpredictable variable? It doesn't collapse immediately. It trembles. And trembling is always the warning sign. Something else is coming. Something bigger than one interview. Something that connects past decisions to present consequences. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with what Andrew said, but with what his timing implies. Because if he was willing to start talking, someone else might be next. The truth never stays contained forever. Not in a world where information spreads faster than protection. Not in a family built on tradition facing a culture built on exposure. The silence was broken. The question now is, what happens when the next crack appears? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It didn't begin with a scandal. It began with a sentence so ordinary that most people missed the danger inside it. A reporter had asked what seemed like a routine question. the kind royals are trained to navigate without hesitation. But this time, something was different. Andrew didn't rush his answer. He didn't deflect. He didn't smile politely and move on. Instead, he paused. A long, uncomfortable pause that stretched just a little too far, long enough for every camera operator to adjust their framing, long enough for every journalist to lift their heads. Then he said it, a sentence that would rewrite the entire conversation. I spent more time with Meghan than people realize. That was it. No dramatics. No emphasis. Just a quiet statement delivered in a room where silence suddenly became heavy. Because the royal family doesn't deal in casual phrasing. Every word is measured, filtered, rehearsed. So when something breaks that pattern, even slightly, it becomes a signal. And the signal was unmistakable. This was not a slip. It was intentional. But here's the question that instantly formed in the minds of everyone listening. Why would a man who has avoided public vulnerability for years suddenly choose openness now? What changed? What pushed him to speak in a way that risked stirring questions the palace has worked tirelessly to avoid? That is where the story begins, not with the statement itself, but with the reaction that followed. Because reactions reveal more than confessions. The first reaction wasn't from the press. It was from the room. A tightening of posture, a shift in energy. People exchanged glances, the kind that say everything without saying a word. It was as if every person present suddenly realized they were witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen. Something unscripted. But the strangest part? Andrew didn't seem nervous. He seemed almost relieved, as if holding the sentence in had been harder than releasing it. And that is what unsettled the palace most. Because the royal system survives on predictability, on members who follow the rhythm, not disrupt it. And Andrew had just stepped off the script, not with a denial, but with a subtle opening, a doorway into a timeline the public never knew existed. The question became unavoidable. When did this time together happen? Before Meghan married into the family? After? Privately? Publicly? And why was it never mentioned until now? People instinctively search for the most dramatic explanation. But sometimes the most disruptive truths are the quiet ones, the ones that challenge the official version of events simply by existing. Because the public believed they knew the sequence. Meghan met Harry. Meghan entered the royal world. Meghan interacted with the family through official channels. Clean. Controlled. Linear. But Andrew's words suggested something different. Overlap. Overlap is dangerous. Overlap changes narrative. Overlap creates questions that can't be unasked. And the first question was this. How far back do their interactions actually go? To answer that, you have to understand the palace rule no one ever talks about. The royal family always meets new partners long before the public does. Introductions don't happen at weddings. They happen quietly, discreetly, long before announcements are made. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If Andrew knew Meghan earlier than the public timeline suggests, then the story the world believes may only be the edited version, the version designed for public consumption. And edited stories always leave out something important. That's why the palace reacted so quickly. Not because Andrew said too much, but because he said just enough. Enough to open the door without stepping fully inside. The reporters in that room knew it instantly. You can tell when a moment changes from routine to historic. Journalists stop typing and start listening. The air shifts. The silence becomes tense. The interview becomes dangerous. That shift happened the second Andrew spoke. And while the public only saw the clip, those who were there felt the weight behind it. Because it wasn't the content of the sentence that caused concern. It was the implication. More time than people realize. More access than previously acknowledged. More history than has ever been discussed publicly. And yet he didn't elaborate. He didn't clarify. He didn't walk it back. He just let the statement hang in the air like unfinished business. Which leads to the next question, the one that changed everything. Was this the beginning of honesty? Or the beginning of something else entirely? The palace treated it like a crisis. Phones started buzzing before the cameras even stopped recording. Advisors moved quickly, not to silence Andrew, but to contain interpretation. Because the monarchy fears misinterpretation more than truth. Truth can be managed. Misinterpretation spreads uncontrollably. Within hours, a statement emerged. It didn't deny the comment. It didn't correct it. It simply redirected attention, a classic royal tactic when they have no safe angle to defend. But redirection only works when curiosity is low. And curiosity had just skyrocketed. People wanted context. Reporters wanted timeline. Insiders wanted answers. Even royal supporters, usually loyal to silence, began asking questions behind closed doors. Because Andrew's comment implied something deeper than familiarity. It implied familiarity without official explanation. And nothing is more dangerous to the monarchy than unexplained proximity. Think about that for a moment. In royal life, everything is recorded. Appearances are logged. Schedules are tracked. Interactions are cataloged. So if time was spent that never appeared on the record, the absence becomes the story, which raises the possibility that made insiders most uneasy. If Andrew's comment was true, then the public version of events might not just be incomplete, it might be strategically incomplete. That's when analysts began examining old footage. Not the obvious moments, the subtle ones. Background interactions at charity galas, passing conversations at receptions, the kind of moments that mean nothing at the time and everything in hindsight. And slowly, a realization formed. There were more overlapping events than anyone remembered. Not dramatic ones, not scandalous ones, just enough to prove one point. They crossed paths more than the official narrative suggests. And that changes everything. Because when history shifts, interpretation shifts. When interpretation shifts, loyalty shifts. And loyalty is the royal family's most fragile currency. But here's the part almost no one noticed. Andrew didn't look pressured. He looked prepared, as if he knew the consequences and accepted them before he spoke. Which means the timing wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. So the question becomes, was this a warning? A correction? A confession? Or the first move in something larger than anyone realizes? Because what happened after that comment didn't unfold slowly. It escalated. Connections were drawn. Private sources came forward. People who had stayed silent began hinting at information they once refused to discuss. The comment didn't close a chapter. It opened one. And the next page wasn't just unexpected, it was explosive. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What most people don't understand is that the royal family doesn't panic over what is said. They panic over what might come next. So while the public replayed the clip for entertainment, the palace replayed it for risk assessment. Advisors gathered in rooms far from cameras, asking the only question that mattered inside those walls. Was Andrew done talking? Or was this just the beginning? Because a single uncontrolled sentence can trigger a chain reaction in the royal world. Not instantly, but quietly, like a fuse burning beneath the surface. And every insider knows the rule. Once a royal breaks silence voluntarily, they rarely stop at one revelation. But to understand why this comment sent shockwaves deeper than the public realized, you need to understand Andrew's history with interviews. He has always been careful, sometimes too careful. Every past appearance was rehearsed, guarded, cautious. So why did this moment feel different? Because the tone didn't match the content. He didn't sound like someone telling a story. He sounded like someone preparing the world for what was coming next. And that changed the stakes. Suddenly, it wasn't about whether Andrew and Meghan interacted more than the public knew. It was about why he chose to confirm it now. Royal behavior always has a pattern. Silence, deflection, or denial. But this was something else entirely. This was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement creates curiosity. Curiosity creates exposure. And exposure is the one thing the monarchy cannot control once it begins. That's why royal experts reacted the way they did, with confusion first, then alarm. You could hear it in their voices during broadcast panels that night. At first, they brushed the comment aside as irrelevant, a harmless sentence taken out of context. But as the hours passed, something shifted. They realized the danger wasn't in what Andrew said. It was in what the public would now ask. The narrative had officially escaped containment. Because here's the truth. People don't care about stories that are complete. They care about stories with missing pieces. And suddenly, this story had a missing piece the size of a locked room. The next morning, the press headlines didn't scream accusations. They asked questions. Open-ended, unresolved questions. The worst kind for a royal family that relies on narrative closure. Questions like, why was this never mentioned before? How many interactions took place? What was the nature of those private conversations? And most importantly, why is Prince Andrew talking now? No one had answers. Not even the palace. Because for the first time in years, They weren't controlling the conversation, they were reacting to it. And that is a position the monarchy is never comfortable in. But the most telling shift didn't happen publicly. It happened privately. People who once dismissed rumors began reconsidering them. Insiders who used to roll their eyes at speculation suddenly stopped laughing. The tone changed from disbelief to curiosity, and curiosity is the gateway to uncovering things that were never meant to surface. The palace understood this immediately. They weren't just trying to manage public perception. They were trying to prevent internal unraveling. Because when one royal breaks formation, others start to question the value of staying silent. And here's the part almost no one is talking about. Andrew did not look like someone who misspoke. He looked like someone who had been waiting for the moment, waiting for the question, waiting for the opportunity. And that makes the situation infinitely more dangerous. Because if the statement was intentional, then the silence that followed wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. That means he knows more than he said. It means the comment was a test balloon. It means he wanted to see the reaction before deciding what to reveal next. And that leads to the possibility no one in the palace wants to consider. What if this wasn't the end of the conversation? What if it was the opening move? Every major royal scandal in modern history began the same way, with a quiet sentence people underestimated. A sentence that seemed harmless. A sentence that didn't sound explosive. A sentence that only made sense in hindsight. Princess Diana's first subtle remarks. Prince Harry's early hints about family tension. Now Andrew's understated acknowledgement. History repeats itself. Not loudly, quietly, at first. Then the cracks widen. And once they widen, they never close again. Because the royal family is not afraid of truth. They are afraid of timing. And Andrew chose the worst possible moment. A moment when the monarchy is already under public pressure, when internal divisions are rumored to be growing, when trust is at its weakest point. That is what makes the comment dangerous. Not the content. The timing. Because timing turns a sentence into a threat. So the question becomes, was this timing accidental or deliberate? People close to Andrew claim he has been frustrated for years, not because of public perception, but because of what he sees as selective silence within the family. Silence used to protect some while isolating others. And when someone feels isolated long enough, something predictable happens. They stop protecting the system that no longer protects them. If that's true, then Andrew's comment wasn't a confession. It was a signal, a message to the palace, a warning that silence is no longer guaranteed. And nothing terrifies the monarchy more than a royal with nothing left to lose. Because that is how secrets surface, not through leaks, through voices. Voices that were once controlled. Voices that are no longer afraid. But the question the world still hasn't answered is the simplest one of all. What exactly happened between Andrew and Meghan that makes this moment significant? The comment alone doesn't explain it. The reaction does. People inside the palace don't panic over rumors. They panic over truth disguised as rumor. And the speed of their response revealed everything. They moved fast because they knew something the public doesn't. Something that changes the context of Andrew's words. Something that explains why silence lasted this long. Something that is finally starting to surface. Because this story isn't just about the past. It's about what's coming. And what comes next will not just challenge public perception. It will force the royal family to confront a history they never expected to revisit. Andrew opened the door. Now the world is waiting to see what, or who, walks through it next. Because what came after that comment wasn't just unexpected. It was explosive, and no one, not even the palace, saw it coming. Before anyone could process the weight of Andrew's comment, something strange began happening online. Not outrage, not mockery, something far more dangerous. People started paying attention, not to the headline, but to the dates. Because every royal story has a timeline. The public sees the clean version, the polished sequence of events that appear straight and organized. But behind the scenes, nothing is ever that tidy. And when timelines don't line up, the truth doesn't disappear. It slips through the cracks. The first question that erupted across social media was simple. How early did Prince Andrew actually know Meghan Markle? On the surface, the answer seemed obvious. Sometime after she began dating Prince Harry. That's the version everyone accepted because that's the version they were given. But the internet doesn't settle for simple anymore. Within hours, screenshots surfaced of overlapping appearances at philanthropic events that predated Meghan's engagement announcement. Not front and center photos. Not official portraits. Background moments. Passing frames. The kind of images that mean nothing until someone asks, why were they in the same place before the world was told they ever met? And that's when the conversation changed. Because coincidences are harmless. Until there are too many of them. People began reconstructing timelines the palace never expected anyone to revisit. Not journalists. Not royal historians. Regular people with laptops, curiosity, and time. The most unstoppable combination in the digital age. One post simply asked, if Meghan was unknown to the public then, how did she end up invited to events that never included outsiders? No one had an answer. Not even the experts paid to have them. And here's where things became uncomfortable for the palace. Every time someone tried to dismiss the overlap as coincidence, another overlooked detail surfaced. A charity reception, a private networking dinner, a guest list with names that shouldn't intersect, but somehow did. Nothing explosive, nothing scandalous, just enough to prove one dangerous truth. Meghan didn't enter the royal world suddenly. She entered gradually, quietly, long before cameras were rolling. But that wasn't the part that alarmed insiders most. It was the realization that Andrew's access during that period was far greater than the public remembers. Not because he was center stage, but because he operated in the shadows, attending events that never made headlines, participating in circles that functioned outside the spotlight. So when he said he spent more time with Meghan than people realize, it wasn't an exaggeration. It was a correction. And corrections imply something even more unsettling. The original version of the story was incomplete. Ask yourself something. If the palace knew Meghan was interacting with family members earlier than the public narrative suggests, why hide it? Why edit the timeline? Why allow the world to believe their first interactions happened much later? There are only 3 reasons institutions rewrite timelines. To protect someone, to protect something, or to prevent the truth from becoming the story. So which one applies here? Royal experts scrambled for explanations. Some claimed early meetings were routine. Others suggested the events were coincidental. But none of them could explain why the palace never mentioned any of it before, especially when transparency would have neutralized suspicion. Silence doesn't erase doubt. Silence feeds it. And just when the conversation began cooling down, something unexpected happened. A former event coordinator, someone who had never spoken publicly about anything related to the royals, hinted that Meghan's introduction into certain circles was not spontaneous and not nearly as recent as the public believes. They didn't elaborate. They didn't name names. But they didn't have to. One vague statement can ignite more chaos than a confirmed fact. Because rumors travel fast. But mysteries travel faster. People began asking new questions. Deeper, sharper, more uncomfortable. Was Meghan introduced to the family earlier for evaluation? Was someone advising her privately before the relationship became public? And the most explosive question of all, did Prince Andrew play a role that no one ever knew about? The palace's silence only amplified the speculation. No corrections, no clarifications, just stillness, the kind that suggests not confidence, but caution. Because the royal family doesn't stay silent when a rumor is harmless. They stay silent when a rumor is close. And here's where the story turns. The moment analysts began connecting Meghan and Andrew's early-stage proximity, another curious detail resurfaced, something most people had forgotten until now. There was a gap in Andrew's public schedule during the exact period Meghan began appearing in royal-adjacent circles. Not a week, not a month, several months. No public engagements, no photographed appearances, no official explanations. Disappearing is normal for celebrities. It is never normal for royals. Every absence is accounted for, unless the account is intentional. So what was happening during that time? Where was he? Who was he meeting? And why does the palace refuse to explain that gap even now? Some insiders claim it was personal retreat. Others whisper it was strategic withdrawal. But there is a third possibility, the one no one wants to say out loud. The missing months weren't absence. They were activity that was never meant to appear on the record. Think about that. If the timeline was edited once, what makes anyone believe it wasn't edited more than once? The palace has always relied on one strategy. Control the story before the story controls you. But Andrew's comment did something they never planned for. It reopened a timeline they had already sealed. And once a sealed timeline is cracked open, nothing stays buried. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. Quietly. Patiently. Until someone, intentionally or not, turns the key. And Andrew didn't just turn it. He left it in the lock. Which brings us to the question the world hasn't dared to ask yet. If this is just the timeline, what happens when we get to the reason? Because what comes next doesn't just challenge what the public believed. It challenges what the palace needs the public to believe. And what came after this realization would change the entire direction of the story. And no one saw it coming. The deeper people looked, the more unsettling the pattern became. Because timelines don't just shift on their own. Someone shifts them. And when multiple unrelated sources begin hinting at the same conclusion, that Meghan's presence within royal-adjacent spaces began earlier than acknowledged, the question stops being speculative. It becomes structural, which means the palace wasn't reacting to Andrew's words because they were shocking. They were reacting because they were accurate. There's a difference. Accuracy threatens control. And control is the only thing that keeps the monarchy functioning in a world where perception outweighs tradition. But here's where the story turns from curious to dangerous. As more digital researchers began piecing together overlooked dates, another discovery emerged, one that had been hiding in plain sight for years. A single event, not large, not glamorous, barely covered by the press. A charity dinner hosted months before Meghan and Harry's relationship went public. No photos of the two together, no dramatic moment, just one detail that refused to disappear. Prince Andrew was listed as an attending patron. Meghan Markle was listed as an invited guest. Not industry-standard placement. Not the kind of event where unknown actresses were casually included. So how did she end up there? And more importantly, who put her name on the list? Guest lists are not random. They are curated, approved, checked, especially when royals are involved. Someone facilitated that access. Someone made that introduction. And the palace has never explained it. Not then. Not now. Because explaining it would require acknowledging that Meghan's entry into that world was not spontaneous. It was structured. And structured beginnings always imply intention. That single detail reignited the conversation online. Not with outrage. With purpose. People realized the timeline wasn't broken by accident. It was designed to hide a sequence the public was never meant to analyze. And that introduces a much larger possibility. If Meghan entered the royal orbit earlier than acknowledged, what else happened earlier than the public was told? One insider, someone whose credibility was quietly respected, made an indirect comment that unsettled everyone who heard it. Nothing in the royal world happens without layers. What you see is never the first layer. Layers. Plural. Meaning. There was the public story. There was the private truth. And somewhere in between was the version the palace needed the world to believe. But here's where the timeline becomes explosive. Andrew's sudden willingness to speak didn't just reopen a closed sequence. It exposed something far more fragile. The royal family no longer agrees on which version of the timeline should stand. Because if everyone were aligned, the reaction would have been unified. It wasn't. Some sources downplayed the comment. Others avoided the topic entirely. And a few, very few, refused to answer when asked. Silence can mean many things. But refusal? Refusal is confession without words. It means the safest answer is no answer at all. And the palace knows that the moment one person stops following the script, everyone else has a decision to make. Stay aligned with the official version. Or protect themselves. Because loyalty in the royal world isn't emotional. It's transactional. And transactions change when risk increases. This is why Andrew's comment mattered more internally than externally. The public heard curiosity. The palace heard instability. Instability forces preparation. Preparation means one thing. They expect more to surface. Not rumors. Information. Which brings us to the part no one outside the walls has processed yet. There is a reason Andrew emphasized time. Not relationship, not opinion, not emotion. Time. Time is trackable. Time is provable. Time is the one detail the palace cannot rewrite once evidence appears. And evidence always appears eventually, especially when people begin looking in the right places. Which leads to the most pressing question of this chapter. If this many early-stage interactions existed, why were they erased from the public record? There are only two explanations. The first is the innocent one. The palace wanted to protect Meghan from early scrutiny. But if that were true, They would have mentioned it later, after she married, to normalize the timeline. They didn't. Not once. Not in interviews. Not in documentaries. Not in memoirs. Not in press statements. Which leaves the second explanation, the uncomfortable one. The palace didn't hide the early timeline to protect Meghan. They hid it to protect themselves. Because early access raises suspicion, and suspicion raises questions. Questions about vetting. Questions about strategy. Questions about who knew what and when. And that brings us to the detail that changed everything. A journalist discovered that during the exact same months Meghan began appearing in selective circles, Andrew attended a private briefing unrelated to his usual duties, a meeting involving communications advisors, not charity officials. That was not routine. That was coordination. And coordination is never accidental. Especially not in a family where reputation is currency and narrative is survival. So now the picture looks different. Not scandalous. Strategic. Which is why the palace response wasn't denial. It was silence. Denial ends conversations. Silence keeps them contained. But silence also does something the palace didn't anticipate. It gives the public space to think. And thinking audiences are dangerous audiences. Because once people start connecting dots on their own, the palace loses control over how the story evolves. Which brings us to the final turning point of this chapter. As online discussions intensified, someone resurfaced a forgotten interview clip, a brief exchange from years earlier where Andrew was asked about modernizing the monarchy. At the time, it seemed unimportant. Now, it sounded very different. He said, "Change doesn't come from the outside. It starts inside, long before anyone recognizes it." It didn't matter what he meant then. It matters now. Because for the first time, the public began wondering, was Meghan's arrival into the royal world really a disruption? Or was it part of a shift already happening behind the scenes? And if that shift began earlier than anyone realized, who else knew? Who else participated? Who else stayed silent? The timeline was no longer a sequence. It was a map. And maps don't reveal destinations. They reveal paths. Which leads to the only question that matters moving forward. If this is how the story begins, what happens when we reach the part the palace has been trying to avoid? Because what comes next isn't speculation. It's consequence. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Every royal story has two versions. The one the world sees. And the one that happens behind closed doors. Most of the public never thinks about the second version because they're not supposed to. The palace works hard to make sure the outside world believes that everything important happens in front of cameras, ceremonies, speeches, appearances, smiles. But the real decisions? They happen where lenses aren't allowed. And that's where this chapter begins. Because once Andrew's comment forced people to examine the timeline, the next logical question emerged. Where did these private interactions actually happen? Not the public events. Not the photographed moments. The unseen ones. Moments that don't appear in archives, but change everything anyway. At first, people assumed the obvious, accidental run-ins, brief conversations during large gatherings, polite introductions. The kind of interactions that carry no meaning. But the deeper analysts dug, the more they found hints that suggested something entirely different. These meetings weren't accidental. They were arranged. Not publicly. Not officially. Quietly. And when royal meetings are arranged quietly, they usually fall into one of three categories: internal assessment, damage control, or preparation. So which one was this? To answer that, you have to look at the pattern. Because coincidences don't repeat. Patterns do. Several sources who were present at private charity briefings recalled something strange. Meghan attending sessions that typically only included long-term partners or individuals preparing for future involvement with royal foundations. But at the time, no one questioned it. She was friendly, professional, approachable. People assumed she was simply being considered for charity support. But consider this. The royal family does not introduce non-family members into operational spaces without approval. The unseen ones. Moments that don't appear in archives, but change everything anyway. At first, people assumed the obvious, accidental run-ins, brief conversations during large gatherings, polite introductions. The kind of interactions that carry no meaning. But the deeper analysts dug, the more they found hints that suggested something entirely different. These meetings weren't accidental. They were arranged. Not publicly. Not officially. Quietly. And when royal meetings are arranged quietly, they usually fall into one of three categories: internal assessment, damage control, or preparation. So which one was this? To answer that, you have to look at the pattern. Because coincidences don't repeat. Patterns do. Several sources who were present at private charity briefings recalled something strange. Meghan attending sessions that typically only included long-term partners or individuals preparing for future involvement with royal foundations. But at the time, no one questioned it. She was friendly, professional, approachable. People assumed she was simply being considered for charity support. But consider this. The royal family does not introduce non-family members into operational spaces without approval, which means someone approved her presence. Someone vouched for her. Someone opened a door that normally stays locked. And then, something else surfaced. A former staff assistant, speaking anonymously, claimed there were internal introductions that happened long before Meghan's relationship with Harry was acknowledged publicly. When pressed, the source said only one sentence: "Not all introductions are social." That single line changed everything, because it suggested Meghan wasn't simply entering the royal world as a romantic partner. She was entering as someone being evaluated, observed, by more than just one family member. Which raises a new question. Why was Andrew present at so many of these internal spaces during that period? He was not Harry's mentor. He was not the key decision-maker. He was not part of the couple's inner orbit. And yet, there he was, repeatedly appearing in environments that overlapped with Meghan's early access. This is where the story shifts. Because Andrew wasn't a spectator in those settings. He had influence. Not public influence. Internal influence. The kind that shapes decisions before they reach the surface. It wasn't always that way. Years earlier, Andrew held a visible role, traveling, representing the monarchy, supporting initiatives. But over time, his public presence shrank while something else expanded. His behind-the-scenes involvement. People outside the palace assumed his role had diminished. People inside knew better. Visibility and relevance are not the same thing. Some of the most influential royals in history operated almost entirely out of sight. So the idea that Andrew may have played a part in Meghan's early integration isn't baseless. It's logical. But here's the part that unsettled insiders the most. When asked directly whether he had been involved in Meghan's early introductions, Andrew did not deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just said, "There is more context to that period than people understand." More context. That phrase echoed across every newsroom. Context means there is missing information. Context means the timeline is not the whole picture. Context means the public narrative may have left something out, intentionally. So what was it? Why were these internal rooms so important? Why was Andrew there? And why is the palace still refusing to explain it? To understand that, you need to know one thing. The royal family does not prepare for change reactively. They prepare for it quietly, years before the public sees the result. That means Meghan's arrival wasn't just a romantic milestone. It may have been part of a larger internal shift, a modernization effort, a strategic adjustment, a recalibration of who the monarchy wanted to be. And if that's true, then Andrew wasn't speaking out of nostalgia or regret. He was speaking out of relevance. Because people don't reveal their involvement in something unless they want credit or distance. Which one applies here? That depends on what happened next. Inside the palace, reactions split into two groups. Some believed Andrew was trying to rewrite his legacy, to attach himself to a story that reshaped the monarchy, not damaged it. Others believed something more concerning. He was signaling that he holds information the palace cannot afford to ignore. Information that connects decisions made behind closed doors to consequences unfolding now. Because here's the truth most people forget. Secrecy is only powerful when everyone involved agrees to maintain it. The second someone breaks the agreement, the entire structure becomes unstable. And Andrew's comment was the first crack. But it may not be the last. Sources close to palace advisors claimed that after Andrew's interview, private discussions accelerated, not about public messaging, but about internal exposure. Who knows what? Who was present when? Who could speak next? The fear wasn't scandal. The fear was sequence. Because scandals can be denied. Timelines cannot. And multiple insiders hinted at the same thing. If more people begin talking, the internal decisions from that period will be impossible to separate from the outcomes happening now. Meaning, this isn't just a chapter from the past. It's a thread running straight into the present. And the palace does not know where it ends, which is why their reaction shifted from control to containment. Containment means one thing. They are not trying to stop the story. They are trying to limit how much of it comes out at once. But here's the problem with containment. It only works when the people holding the information still feel loyal. And loyalty inside the royal family has never been more fractured. Because once Andrew spoke, something changed inside those walls. People stopped assuming silence was guaranteed. People stopped assuming the past would stay buried. And people started asking themselves a dangerous question. If he spoke, why shouldn't I? Pressure doesn't crack institutions. Pattern does. And the pattern has already started. Which brings us to the next unresolved question, the one at the center of Chapter 3. What exactly happened inside those private rooms? Not rumors, not assumptions, the real conversations. Because if those conversations resurface, the story won't just expand, it will shift direction entirely. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The strangest part about these private spaces is that almost no one outside the institution even knows they exist. The public imagines royal life as a series of grand rooms, gilded halls, red carpets, flashing cameras. But the true centers of power are quiet, windowless meeting areas with low lighting and no photographers, where decisions are made long before anyone hears about them. That is where Meghan appeared before the public ever knew her name. Not as an official guest, not as a fiancée, not as a duchess, but as someone being observed. A former staff member, who never spoke publicly before, described those early meetings in a brief off-record remark. There are rooms where the future is discussed before it becomes reality. That sentence confirmed something royal watchers had only suspected. Meghan wasn't introduced into the system suddenly. She was filtered in. Gradually, carefully, deliberately. And the presence of Prince Andrew in those same spaces was not coincidence. It was structure. Because even though his public influence had faded, his internal position had not disappeared. Older royals often shift roles from visible representation to silent advisory positions. And Andrew was one of the few who still held access to areas not open to newer members of the family. So the idea that he was simply around during that period is misleading. He wasn't around. He was involved. The palace will never admit that publicly. Not because it's incriminating, but because it reveals how the institution really operates. And the monarchy depends on the illusion of simplicity. A love story, a wedding, a smooth transition. The reality was far more complex. There were assessments, concerns, internal disagreements. Some members believed Meghan represented modernization. Others feared disruption. And a small group simply didn't know what to expect. That uncertainty led to meetings. Meetings led to evaluations. Evaluations led to decisions that were never documented publicly. And in several of those meetings, according to multiple internal sources, Andrew was present, not as a decision-maker, but as someone whose experience was still considered useful. That detail changes the story in one significant way. Andrew wasn't talking about random interactions. He was talking about a period the palace worked extremely hard to keep sealed. Which explains the reaction, not panic, urgency. Because if the public discovered that Meghan was being reviewed by internal advisors long before her relationship became public, it would raise a question the palace never once asked. Why was she evaluated differently from others? The official narrative says she was welcomed warmly. But behind the scenes, the picture appears less straightforward. One insider described those early discussions as cautious optimism mixed with internal hesitation. Not rejection, not hostility, just uncertainty. But uncertainty is dangerous in a system built on confidence. Which brings us back to the private rooms. Sources say these were not emotional discussions. They were logistical ones. How would the media respond? How would public perception shift? How would Meghan's previous career be integrated or controlled? Nothing was decided instantly. It never is. Royal decisions move slowly, like tectonic plates, unnoticed until the ground shifts beneath everyone's feet. But here's the detail almost everyone missed. During those same months, Meghan was invited to observe, not participate in, select planning sessions for philanthropic partnerships. That has never happened with any new partner before. Observation implies preparation. Preparation implies expectation. Expectation implies intention, meaning. Someone, somewhere, believed she would eventually hold an official role, long before Harry ever proposed. So the question becomes, who anticipated her future involvement? And more importantly, why was Andrew consistently present during that stage? Some speculate he was simply fulfilling his duties as patron to overlapping charities. Others believe his presence was part of a larger internal alignment. But there is a third possibility, the one insiders whisper privately. Andrew was not overseeing Meghan's introduction. He was witnessing it. If that's true, his recent willingness to speak is not random. It's reflective. People who witness the beginning of something often feel compelled to speak when they see the ending unfolding differently than expected. And inside the palace, the ending is not what anyone predicted. No one imagined that Meghan would leave the institution. No one imagined the public divide. No one imagined the private fallout. Which leads to the most important question of this chapter. Is Andrew speaking now because he feels responsible, or because he feels removed? Responsibility inspires explanation. Removal inspires exposure. Which one applies? It depends on what he knows and what he's willing to say next. Because sources close to palace aides insist that after the interview, one concern overshadowed all others. If Andrew begins talking about internal processes, the public will learn how decisions are actually made. And the monarchy knows that once that curtain is pulled back, it cannot be closed again. This isn't about scandal. It's about structure. What Andrew hinted at threatens the illusion that protects the institution more than any personal rumor ever could. Because scandals fade, systems unravel. And that's why his comment mattered. Not because of Meghan. Because of what it reveals about the royal machine. Which brings us to the final turning point of this chapter. A journalist who has covered the monarchy for 2 decades revealed that, shortly after Andrew's interview, a quiet change occurred inside palace communications. Certain internal documents were moved from standard access to restricted classification. Not destroyed. Protected. Documents only get protected when they contain something that cannot afford misinterpretation. Meaning, the palace isn't worried about what Andrew already said. They're worried about what he might say next. And that leads to the cliffhanger this chapter cannot escape. If Andrew has already opened the door, what happens when someone else walks through it? Because one royal speaking is unusual, 2 royals speaking is unprecedented. And according to insiders, someone else has already been asking questions. Someone who was there. Someone who remembers that period very differently. Someone the palace cannot silence. What comes next isn't speculation. It's escalation. And no one, not the press, not the public, not even the monarchy, is prepared for the next voice that steps forward. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every major turning point in royal history begins the same way. Not with a public announcement, but with a quiet shift behind the scenes. A single voice deciding that silence is no longer an option. And after Andrew's unexpected comment, that shift happened faster than anyone predicted. It didn't come from a journalist. It didn't come from a critic. It didn't come from an outsider. It came from someone who was there. Someone who knew the internal landscape during the exact period the palace hoped the world would forget. Someone who, until now, had said nothing. The first sign appeared not in the news, but in an encrypted message sent to a veteran reporter. The kind of reporter the palace respects because they know the difference between noise and danger. The message was brief. I was in the room. Andrew isn't lying. No name. No further explanation. Just confirmation. And confirmation is more explosive than accusation. Accusations can be dismissed. Confirmation cannot. The reporter responded immediately, asking the only question that mattered. What room? Hours passed before another reply came through. You don't know about the early reviews. But the family does. Early reviews. That phrase hit the media world like a lightning strike. Because it implied something the palace never wanted publicly acknowledged. Meghan's integration into the royal structure wasn't spontaneous. It was evaluated. Not after she married into the family. Before. The reporter pressed again, asking who authorized the reviews, who attended, and why they happened. The source didn't give dates or names, but they gave something more valuable. Someone needs to tell the truth before the wrong version becomes history. And just like that, everything changed. Because the palace could control the narrative when only one person spoke. They cannot control it when a second voice steps forward, especially when that voice was present. The reporter attempted to verify the source, a process that normally takes days, sometimes weeks. This time, it took 24 hours. The source was real. They had been employed inside the institution during that exact period. Not in a minor role, not in a distant office. They had access. Enough access to confirm what many had only suspected. There were conversations about Meghan long before the public ever saw her beside Harry. And Andrew was part of that period, not as a supervising figure, but as a witness to internal decisions. But here's the detail that made the situation even more volatile. The insider didn't sound vengeful. They sounded worried. Worried about what the palace might do next. Worried that rewriting the past would only escalate the fallout. Worried that silence would allow the wrong narrative to dominate. People assume insiders speak for attention. But insiders who speak reluctantly are the most dangerous because they aren't motivated by gain. They're motivated by fear. So the reporter asked the question that would define everything that followed. What are they trying to hide? The reply came quickly. It's not about hiding. It's about who made the decisions and who wants to rewrite their involvement. That sentence carried more weight than anything Andrew had said, because it suggested the internal conflict wasn't about Meghan at all. It was about responsibility. Who supported her early integration? Who opposed it? Who now wants distance? Who now wants credit? The palace has survived centuries by presenting unity. But unity is a performance. And performances crack when too many people know the script. Which may explain why, according to the insider, tension inside the walls was already rising before Andrew ever spoke. His comment didn't create the fracture. It exposed it. And fractures don't stay contained. They spread. But here's the part almost no one in the public understands. The insider did not reach out because of what Andrew said. They reached out because of how the palace reacted. The speed told me they weren't prepared, the source wrote. If they were confident, they would have ignored it. That statement revealed a truth only insiders can see. Powerful institutions panic silently. Not with statements. Not with denials. With behavior. And the palace's behavior, sudden meetings, restricted access, tightened communication protocols, suggested one thing. They fear what comes next. Not what has already been said. Because what's already said can be dismissed. What hasn't been said cannot be controlled. The reporter asked the insider one final question before pausing communication. What exactly did Andrew witness? The reply was chilling in its simplicity, more than they ever planned to admit. That was it. No elaboration, no details. But sometimes the most alarming sentence is the one that answers nothing, because it means there is more, a lot more. The reporter attempted to reconnect the following day. No response. Whether the source went silent voluntarily or was silenced involuntarily remains unknown. But one thing became immediately clear. If one insider is willing to speak, there are others. Silence inside institutions rarely breaks alone. It breaks in sequence. And sequence is momentum. Momentum is danger. Especially for a monarchy already struggling under the weight of public skepticism. Meanwhile, inside the palace, something else was happening. Something that confirmed the insider's message without a single word. According to someone familiar with internal operations, senior staff were instructed to review communications from the period surrounding Meghan's early appearances. Not publicly, not formally, quietly. Reviews only happen for two reasons: preparation or defense. Preparation suggests anticipation. Defense suggests fear. And when the palace prepares and defends at the same time, it means they no longer know which direction the story will go. That uncertainty is the most destabilizing force inside royal walls. Because the monarchy depends on one belief. The past is settled. But what happens when the past becomes unsettled? The present begins to unravel. And the unraveling had only begun. Because the insider didn't just confirm Andrew's involvement. They hinted at something else.